this morning to express our love for and to bid farewell to Sara Schafler, who's gone to her eternal home. It's a very sad moment, and her passing, I am sure, leaves a void that only time and love can begin to fill. But it's also a moment to say thank you to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, to God, for the years that you had on this earth and the great privilege and blessing which was ours to share some of those years with her. It was an honor for me to know her. But before I would say anything, it's appropriate that we call upon family members to offer words of love and remembrance and eulogy. I'd like to start by calling on Seth.
My mother, Sara Ratza Bas Pesach Yerachmiel the Malka, lived a rich and multifaceted life. Speaking of her biblical namesake, the Torah first tells of the years of Sarah's life before turning to her death. And speaking of her life, the Torah says, Vayiyu chaye Sara Shnei Sara, Me'ah ve'esrim shana, ve'sheva shanim shnei chaye Sara, which is a kind of weird way to put it, because if you interpret that in English, it says, and these were the years of Sarah's life, 100 years plus 70 years, 20 years plus 70 years, plus 7 years, these were the days of her life. So Rashi, who's ever the attentive commentator, comments on the reason for that strange construction. And he says that this Torah portion, Chaye Sarah, talks about somebody whose 127 years consisted of different standalone units or phases of her life, each divided by the word Shana, different phases, each of which were equal in merit. There were 127 years consisted of units of 100, of 20, and of 7. When she was 100, Rashi says, she was like 20 with respect to lack of sin. And when she was 20, she was as beautiful as if she was 7. Like her biblical namesake, my mother too lived her life in stages, almost as if she lived multiple lives. And it's appropriate that we speak of the measure of her life before remarking about her death. Born in Toronto, Canada, the youngest of 5 children, Pesach and Molly Edell, her early life was lived in the shadow of her famous grandfather, Rabbi Joseph Weinberg, who came to Toronto from Galicia to become the first Orthodox rabbi of Toronto, Canada. My mother's room is still filled with pictures of her grandfather, including a beautiful oil painting that my mother herself painted of the Galatian Rav, as he was called. Her grandfather, elegant in a silk top hat and tails, with a long tapered cigarette holder and a long white beard. And his house was a meeting place of students, of joyous singing, and of learning that she remembered fondly throughout her life. And you really couldn't understand my mother unless you understood that about her. My mother had a happy childhood in Toronto. She was a student at the Harvard Collegiate High School. I'm not sure if they call that a high school in Canada, where she was awarded the Harvard H for all-around excellence and popularity by acclamation of all of her fellow students, something she was very proud of. And she later graduated from the University of Toronto with a degree in Semitics, which I take as a fancy word for Jewish studies. The second stage of her life then began. That's the one that brought her to New York and ultimately to me and to my brothers and sisters after she followed her sister Connie to New York to take classes, Jewish studies at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary. She met my father riding in an elevator. Typically, my father described it as love at first sight, and my mother said, well, he looked kind of nice. You know? Their meeting blossomed into a full-fledged love affair at Camp Ramon, the Poconos, and the two were married in 1951. My father was ordained as a rabbi in 1951, that same year, and my brother Edell, alav hashalom, unfortunately recently passed away, was born in 1952. Now, it was during this period, around 1950, that my mother chanced to meet a young man who was playing piano and singing beautifully in front of a bunch of students at the second floor of the JTS lounge. She asked him if he would do the same at City College, Hillel, where she was the director of programming. His name was Shlomo Carlebach. You might have heard of him. And it turns out this was his first gig. So he later credited my mother for launching his career. Several more children followed in quick succession as my father took a job first as a rabbi in Gloversville, New York, then assistant director of the Department of Education of the United Synagogue, and finally rabbi of Temple Gates of Prayer in 1961. My parents took the obligation of truth or vu, be fruitful and multiply, very seriously, and they produced 5 children in little more than 6 years. Rena, the baby, brought up the rear in 1963. During those years, we moved from Gloversville to Brooklyn and then to Flushing, Queens, where we lived until 1976, with the exception of the year of 1968 to 69, when we all lived in Jerusalem and my father took a sabbatical. And I remember the years in Flushing, and I see a lot of people here from Flushing, and I'm very happy to see them all here, including Rabbi Taylor and many of our old friends from Temple Gates of Prayer. I remember those years as being quite tumultuous. My father was a very busy, very serious rabbi. He was a towering persona, not only to us children. My mother held it all together. It was my mother who taught us to play catch, to swim. She taught us silly songs that we still remember, including a memorable poem that she learned from a fellow student at the Harvard Collegiate, which I'm sure my siblings can recite from memory even now. It was a poem on the verb to be, and it went, "My love have flew, she done me dirt. I did not knew she were a flirt. Oh, you unschooled, oh, let me bid, do not be fooled as I was did. She have came, she have gone, she have left idle alone. I can never came to she can never came to I, it cannot was." Guess that's kind of a nice epitaph. So my mother was a balabusta, more than the pejorative term housewife. She was a master of the home. But that was hardly all she did. She embarked on a career in education in her own right, culminating in a master's degree in Jewish education from JTS in 1976, the same date that my brother Daniel graduated with a Bachelor in Hebrew Letters in Talmud. I can still see the pictures of the two of them standing side by side in their graduation gowns on that proud day. My mother played the role of Rebbitzin at Temple Gates of Prayer in a very public and activist way. She taught adult education classes, including a class on how to raise Jewish children, which we at the time thought was rather amusing. But now it seems she didn't do all that bad. She koshered numerous congregants' kitchens, some of whom are here, I think. She hosted countless people for Shabbos meals and Shabbat afternoons in the backyard. And of course, the year that we spent in Israel in 68 and 69 had profound effects on all of us. My brother Eliel and my sister Gila, who's here today, Gila is here, both married Israelis and moved to Israel, and as a result, we have a large and growing family in Israel that we are happy to have with us here today. in the presence of my sister Gila. The Temple Gates of Prayer phase was followed by a move to Chicago, where my father gave up the rabbinate and became the superintendent of Board of Jewish Education in Chicago. During this period, my mother developed a passion for genealogy, ultimately authoring an authoritative section in the Encyclopedia Judaica, published in 1984 to 85 on Jewish genealogy, which you'll see in my house if you come and visit us. I think my mother's work in genealogy touched something very deep in her. Other words to describe genealogy might be the search for roots, or that wonderful untranslatable Yiddish word yichus, which roughly might mean relationships, but it means special relationships of particular merit. My mother never lost the love of her ancestral home and family, the sweetness of her father, Zadie Pesach's voice. The memory of her grandfather's home. She wanted to hold on to that family history, and she wanted to help other people do so. I would say that more than anything else, this became her life's work. My mother became the bridge that kept the family memories alive. When the kids were all grown and out of school, my parents moved back to Boston, where my father became the president of Hebrew College in 1987. I still vividly remember my parents' beautiful apartment in Brookline, filled with the beautiful works of art and furniture that my mother collected over the years from all kinds of sources. From estate sales, from little knickknacks she saw here and there, from family trips, and lined from floor to ceiling with my father's books. My mother was not only herself a beauty, which she was. To paraphrase Rashi, she was as beautiful and as elegant at 85 as she was at 25. She also had an eye for beauty and collected many beautiful works of art and objects which she surrounded herself with throughout her life. She maintained her beautiful and graceful appearance to the end. People heard that she died, they couldn't believe it because she looked so fantastic. She was the only one at the atrium still walking around without a walker. Always with a tam on her head, looking spiffy, and she looked great. Tragedy struck when my father died in 1991, early, struck down his prime. But my mother fought through the pain, and she was very, very full of life. She insisted on keeping his memory alive and continued to look for projects for herself, like helping Abe Borenstein, who was a blind elderly art dealer who couldn't get around to see his wife and couldn't take care of his needs. My mother spent countless hours with him. She was always looking for people to help. In 2000, my mother remarried Rabbi Joseph Kelman, the older brother of her childhood friend from Toronto, and moved back to her family home where the story began. She spent 8 happy years married to Joe Kelman, whom she loved dearly, and we are extremely grateful for those happy years and for the gracious way that my mother's been treated as really mishpacha, we all have, by the Kelman family, and I'm happy to see members of the Kelman family here today. My mother finally moved back to New York to the atrium in Riverdale just over a year ago and started yet another phase of her life, meeting many new friends, spending a lot of time in this shul. And we're grateful to the atrium community for the happiness and comfort she found there. So these are the years of the life of Sara Schafler, or Sara Edell Schafler Kelman, Surah Radza Bas Pesach Yerachmiel and Malka. She was a Rebbetzin twice over, an educator, a genealogist, a preserver of family history in Yichus, who raised 6 children, had 18 grandchildren, 11 great-grandchildren, all of whom lived in Israel. A wonderful mother, a friend to many, an educated woman of stature and beauty, someone fun to be around. While I cannot articulate what my mother meant to me any more than I think any child can express that, I can thank her for giving me guitar lessons. I can thank her for her gifts of grace, for her legacy of music, for the joyfulness in which she lived her life, for the advice that she gave even when you didn't want to hear it. I'll also always see her out of the corner of my eye when I daven on the high holidays. I'll see her face at the renewal service that we conduct here at the shul, which we were fortunate to have her join in the past few years. And I'm glad my wife and family got to know her and spend many Pesach Seders with her and time in her home. And I give a special thanks to my wife, Robin, for being so loving and caring to my mother. The words cannot really express. And to my sister Rena for her fierce devotion to my mother in her last years. To my brothers and sisters and to this community for welcoming my mother as one of its own. It says in Proverbs, Mishlei, Shema b'ni musar avicha v'al titosh Torah imecha. Listen, son, to the teaching of your father and do not forsake the Torah of your mother. My father's Torah and my mother's Torah were very different. My father's Torah was that of Theodor Herzl, Zionism, a public leader of the world of ideas, of scholarship. My mother's Torah was the world of tradition, of yichus, of relationship, of family memories, the ties that bind, the Torah of tradition, of beauty, of fun and games and songs, and milut chasadim, of acts of loving kindness. So I will never forsake the Torah of my mother. Yhi zichra b'avrika.